What are some other factors that make markets attractive for startups? One is choose a young industry, which we already talked about. So we want to try to enter markets before they have reached an inflection point. Second point is a very effective indicator that a market is at a good stage of development for a startup company. I talked in the previous slide about how difficult it is to know what is the right timing to enter a market. One indicator we can look at for that is, has a dominant design already been adopted for the underlying infrastructure in this market? Example, let's look at the software market. So if we think about the software market, what is the dominant design for the infrastructure in the PC software market? Meaning, so what is the infrastructure? Infrastructure for the software market, I would describe as operating system. So what is the dominant design for operating systems in the PC market is Windows, or DOS Windows, and it has been for 30 years. So there's clearly a dominant design already in PC software, in PC operating systems, and therefore we don't see startups today creating software to install on PCs, and it's clear that this market is well past its exponential growth phase and in fact is in a rapid decline phase. How about mobile phones? What is the dominant design in operating systems for mobile phones? There are still two mobile phone operating systems that are competing for dominance, so Android and iOS. So here we don't see a dominant design yet in the underlying architecture, and therefore we do see startups still creating successful businesses around mobile apps, which means that this market, although it's not before the inflection point, but is still in exponential growth or fast growth phase and can still be a good market for a startup company. And then what about virtual reality, which I mentioned previously? There are 3 or 4 operating systems in virtual reality, and clearly virtual reality operating system has not achieved a dominant design yet, and therefore we can posit that virtual reality market is still pretty close to its inflection point, and we do see a lot of startups in the virtual reality space. IoT, Internet of Things. What is the dominant design in operating systems for IoT? There's pretty much, at this stage, almost every IoT device has its own operating system, or there are a plethora of IoT operating systems, which strongly indicates that the IoT market has not passed its inflection point, and we do see many companies developing IoT products. This is a very favorable market for startups today. We also, so that's a great indicator that the market timing is good for your startup. We look at markets that are labor intensive rather than capital intensive. If you've been listening carefully, you might feel a little confused about this, because previously I talked about how labor costs make it difficult to scale, for example, restaurant businesses or other labor-intensive industry. So you might wonder, how does this fit together? Here I mean something different. When I talk about labor-intensive versus capital-intensive in this sense, I mean markets where people are more important determinants of success than capital, than money. So we want to be in a market where the people in the company are more important in the company's success than how much money the company has to spend. Why is that so important? Because when startups compete with established companies, they will never be able to compete on, especially in the early days of the startup, they'll never be able to compete on the basis of spending. because large companies will always have more money to spend than startups. So startups want to compete in markets where they won't lose just because they're outspent by established companies. I think a great example of this factor is we can see in the computer gaming sector. So if you remember a few years ago, there was a very successful game on the iPhone that was called Flappy Bird. And this game was developed by what was described as an independent game studio in Vietnam, but in fact, this independent game studio consisted of one person. So you had one game developer in Vietnam developing the most successful game app in the iOS App Store for a couple of months, which is pretty amazing when you think about it, because that means this company with one person was able to outperform all the big gaming companies. And in fact, the computer gaming industry has changed a lot in the last few years due to falling prices of computer hardware and software and distribution of games through internet, which enables small or independent game studios to now compete very effectively with large game producers. This wasn't true 10 years ago, when it was extremely expensive to produce high-quality games, and that made the market not attractive for startups. As the balance of power in the industry shifted from money to people, this became a much more attractive market for startups and remains one today. We also want to look at markets where advertising and branding are less important. This doesn't mean that we won't advertise and attempt to brand our product. It means that we don't want to compete as a startup in a market where success is solely determined by or mainly determined by advertising and strength of brand. Why? First is advertising is expensive, and again, startups won't be able to compete on a dollar-for-dollar basis advertising against established companies. Two, brand. Startups can never compete on the basis of brand initially, because brand takes time to develop. Brand comes from success, successful products. It's circular if a startup is intending to compete from the beginning on the basis of brand, because the goal of the startup's initial competitive strategy is to build a successful brand. So for example, you see very few successful startups in fast-moving consumer goods where advertising and branding are the key to success. We can also look at various types of markets to see which one are more attractive for startups. So typically, startups focus on resegmenting or creating a niche in existing markets, or cloning markets, like I talked about previously. They very rarely are successful in existing markets without a resegmentation strategy. They occasionally create whole new markets, but you can look at each of these options as a startup facing the choice of type of market.